started. So this presentation is on online survey methodology, and you'll notice I changed the title from the announcement. Now it's practical guidelines, and I did that on purpose just because there's so much theory to dig into regarding why people behave in certain ways, and how the fact that you're online, which is a mediated space, right? You're in front of a computer, not in front of a person, and so on. All these different things play into it, and we just simply don't have enough time. You could do an entire graduate course on the theory of this. What I do want to focus on is some of the practical issues that researchers face, and there's a few. So here's just an outline of what I want to cover today. Influences on participation, survey design, and survey platforms that are available. So we'll go through each of these one by one. And starting with influences on participation, there are obviously people involved. So I want to talk about the characteristics of the people who you might be trying to get to fill out your surveys, and what is known to influence their behavior in terms of choosing to participate. The solicitation itself, so you initially contact people, right? So you have to have some sense of what may or may not affect the rates at which people will actually click on the link that you're going to send them, and also the nature of the incentives that are provided, and the influence that has on people's choice to participate, and also if they already participate, whether or not they choose to follow through the entire survey. Certainly, it's always possible to click that little X in the top right corner of your window and just forget about the whole survey, right? So that kind of attrition is something we're trying to prevent. And then next up, under survey design, there are definitely influences on attrition, meaning, again, when folks start out on the survey but then decide to just stop halfway through. And there are also factors that are associated with biased responding. So I'll touch on those a little bit, where depending on how you design your survey, you can actually inadvertently lead people to not respond in ways that they would naturally, so to speak. And then finally, there are different platforms that you can actually use to administer your survey. So I want to go over some of the main ones here: SurveyMonkey, Qualtrics, and psychsurveys.org, and then we'll wrap things up from there. So let's get started. Person characteristics. So again, the main heading, and one of the main issues that you find today is survey fatigue. Basically, we're all bombarded with what may be interpreted as junk mail. Especially if you find yourself on some mailing list, it can be difficult to remove yourself, and so you basically, train your email to filter out messages from unknown senders, right? And research shows that the more invitations that people get to fill out surveys, the lower their participation rates are. So especially when you're looking at institutional emails, such as here at the Chicago School, you'll probably notice these emails coming through every once in a while, inviting you to participate in surveys. And you may have found yourself in a similar situation where the first few you're like, oh, okay, yeah, I'll fill this out, I'll help this person out, and then after a while it's like, oh, okay, and then finally you just start deleting it. I'm not saying that that's what happens, but certainly it's a pattern that's known to exist. So you have to be careful in terms of whether or not you are going to be potentially sending out invitations using lists that are specifically designed to target potential participants. So when we get to the end of this presentation, for example, Qualtrics, which is a survey platform, they have an entire user list where you can say to them, okay, look, I want people who are between the ages of 35 and 45 and have these certain demographic qualities, and then they send out an email blast to all of those users in their database. And those people are expecting those emails. They want to do that because they get paid to do it. But if you have a different set, if you have a different list, which is, for example, let's say Chicago school students, faculty, and staff. Those folks don't get paid to do surveys. So that's where this might become an issue, this idea of survey fatigue. And in fact, if we're looking at student populations, this might not be as bad of an issue. Certainly with like the general population, survey fatigue is known to kick in. But with students, there are mixed findings. So there's this great review article. I highly recommend this. I don't know how to pronounce this person's name, but there's a lot of info on this topic. And certainly some studies find that with students, it's the same as with the general population. Others find that it's not the case. So it's certainly an important point, and you should be aware of it. And if you get a low response rate, you shouldn't beat yourself up that you did something wrong, because potentially it's just survey fatigue that's kicking in. But anyway, it's an important point, so you should definitely be aware of it. And speaking of student populations, there are other demographic factors that are also associated with the rates at which people participate. So for example, females are more likely to participate than males. African Americans are less likely to participate than non-African Americans. And there are actually socioeconomic factors related to participation rates as well. It should come as no surprise that if you're in the sort of lower end of the socioeconomic scale, that you may have limited internet access, right? And if that's the case, then you're less likely to get folks on that lower end of the SES scale to be represented in your data. So the takeaway from that is that you can only generalize your results to people with ready internet access. And if you're specifically interested in studying, let's say, male African Americans in lower SES categories, then you're going to have a more difficult time if you're using online survey methods, right? Because all three of those categories are known to be less likely to respond to solicitations for to participate in surveys. So again, if you do find yourself struggling to get participants, and this is obviously a big deal, right? Because one of the main concerns with conducting surveys is you need a relatively large sample to get meaning out of any analysis. So again, if you're finding yourself in a situation that you're getting low responses, you have to think about why that might be, and certainly the demographics that pertain to your research question, that pertain to the population that you're interested in studying, that all will have an effect on the number of responses you'll get. So it's not always the case that online surveys are the best option. You might need to go, in person or over the phone, or other types of solicitations that are not specific to online methods. That isn't to say that you can't solicit someone in person and give them a link, right? You can hand somebody a piece of paper in real life with a web address written on it, and they can go to the library if they don't have internet access at home, and fill out the survey that way. So there are ways that you can be creative and get around these issues. But right now we're talking about online solicitation specifically. So that's what I want to sort of contextualize things as. Okay, so there's also this factor of personal interest. It definitely influences the decision to participate. Plenty of research shows that if you ask someone about something that they're super interested in, that they're gonna be more likely to participate. And indeed, it's one of the most crucial factors when deciding on survey participation. It's not just a reason, it's one of the biggest ones. And this becomes an issue specifically if you're if you're interested in a specific type of population, whether it's mental health or anything else, folks who have a certain characteristic, they're going to perk up and say, oh, that's me. That is something that is personally meaningful to me, and so let me see what this is all about. And they're also offering me a chance to be in a raffle for a cash prize. Wonderful. Right? Yes, go ahead. Is there a question? No? Okay. Anyway, if you have a question, you can certainly feel free to speak up or type it into the chat box. I have that open here, and I'll answer it during the presentation. You don't have to hold off till the end. If you want to hold off till the end, that's perfectly fine, but don't feel obligated to do so. Okay. So, right. When people decide to participate, that's certainly a good thing. They can also decide not to participate and delete the email or delete whatever notification that is coming their way. But certainly, it's important to try to get them to participate, right? And that's one of the other things I want to talk about is the timing of your solicitation has an effect on whether or not they choose to click through. And this is a strange finding, but if you send out your invitation on a Wednesday morning, that seems to have the highest response rates. Not Tuesday, not Thursday, definitely not Saturday or Sunday. In fact, research shows that if you send it on a weekend, you'll get lower responses, and part of that is that people don't check their email as much, and there's a delay between when they actually, between when you send it out and when they see it. And that's the last thing on people's minds on Monday morning. If you're sending it to a work email list, for example, there's probably stuff that's been piling up, and they have to get to work and so on and so forth. And this would be the last thing on their mind. So anyway, some of these reasons are less important than the fact that Wednesday morning seems to be the best time to actually send out a solicitation. And also, not only time of week, but the time of the year has an effect. So wintertime has the highest response rates. And this is important because a lot of the time, again, if you're going to be using a student list, such as the Chicago School student list, that's not the case. And I'm pretty sure you can guess why, because students are not as engaged with their school email over the winter break. Not just here, I mean in general, right? But that's been found to be the case, that it doesn't necessarily apply to students. So things to keep in mind, right? The timing is something that you may or may not have thought of, but it is in fact associated with getting a higher response rate. And then the topic. This may or may not be the most important one, but basically, if you think about your inbox, right? You know who the email is coming from. You have the subject line or the topic. You have the date or the time that it came in, and maybe, depending on how you have it set up, maybe you'll see 1 or 2 lines of text of the actual email. And so if that's all that you have access to as a potential respondent, then it also is the case that you're going to use that information to decide to either delete the email or click through and actually read the content of it. So people are actually more likely to open and read emails from known or recognized individuals. One example of this is that, here at the Chicago School, we have that email account that sends out those solicitations for research participation. And that is something that you come to be familiar with, right? And you recognize, oh, that's that research solicitation email. I know who or what that is. And, I know that if I click on it, it's not spam. I know that I can read it and see if it's something that's personally interesting to me, whether I want to participate or not. And, that's something to keep in mind, that if you have a good topic and it's coming from a known sender, that people are going to be more likely to at least read what the solicitation is all about. So, to put it another way, setting up a new email account might be tempting, right? Because it helps you keep everything organized. You have a separate email account that you can use to just keep things separate and organized for yourself. But that might not be such a good idea, because then you're basically either having your email filtered to a spam folder for all your respondents, or they don't recognize it when they see it, and so it becomes more likely to be ignored. Okay. As far as the topic goes, in addition to who it's coming from, if you have a reference to an incentive or a survey specifically, that has a negative effect on whether or not people will choose to participate. Conversely, appeals for help have a positive effect. So if your topic is, win a gift card for filling out a survey, that's probably not going to help you. But if you have a topic a subject of an email that says, your help is requested, then that is more likely to have people at least click through and start the survey. And so now the next step, right? Let's say that they click on it, right? They read the topic, they said, okay, fine, I'm going to check this out. Then in the body of the email, what I actually thought was interesting, and I've applied this, and maybe it had an effect, placing the URL, that's the link to your survey, at the bottom of the email. After you've described everything, after you've said what it's all about, you put the link that they can click on at the bottom. Actually increases the response rate over placing it at the top, at the very beginning of your email. And there's also, you know what? That reminder emails shouldn't be there. That's the next slide. That's the only note about the email body. So as far as reminder emails go, so you send out an email, and what typically happens is you get what's called a spike in responding. So basically, you send out an email, and that very same day, when you're doing analytics of response rates, you will see that there's a huge, well, maybe not huge, but a sizable number of participants that respond right away, and then it tapers off. So maybe the next day you have a few stragglers, the day after that, but then it just tapers off and nobody is responding after that. So if you want more data, guess what? You have to send out a reminder email. And this is a common practice. Everybody from the National Science Foundation to student researchers does this. And research has shown that a 2-day reminder gets faster responses than a 5-day reminder. A 2-day reminder meaning a reminder sent 2 days after the original solicitation, and a 5-day reminder obviously 5 days after. So you get faster responses, but each of these versions, a 2-day or a 5-day, they reach a similar asymptote over the course of a month, meaning that if you send out a reminder every 2 days for a month or every 5 days for a month, you end up with the same number of total responses. Now, if you think about it that way, it's like, why would you harass people every 2 days when you can harass them every 5 days and get the same response, right? And also, you're probably thinking, I have to do it for a month. Oh my goodness, that's a long time. More recent research actually shows that after 5 reminders versus 3 reminders, you don't really get any increases in response rates. So basically, what that means is if you send 3 5-day reminders, you're in pretty good shape to know that you're going to get as many responses as you're going to get. So overall, that's 15 days, right? Which is half a month. So yeah, 3 reminders every 5 days is what the doctor ordered, and at that point, you can be relatively certain in that you're going to get as many responses as you're going to get. It's also important to note that if you change the wording of these subsequent reminders, instead of using the same wording over and over and over again, it has a significant positive effect on response rates. So there are many reasons for this. One of which is that the algorithms that email programs use is going to be more likely to filter out your reminder email as spam, because it's basically seeing the same thing come through over and over and over again. So it's just going to redirect it to the spam folder. So if you vary the wording, that's less likely to happen. And also people will feel that it is in fact sort of individualized for them. And on a separate note, it actually, I don't have a point about this, but a bullet point in the PowerPoint, but if you actually use people's names in these reminder emails or in the original solicitation versus not using their names, that doesn't really seem to have an effect on response rates. So it may be tempting to think, oh, if I make it, dear Kuba, or, dear John, whoever, dear Sue, that does not seem to have an impact on whether or not that person is going to respond versus saying, your responses would be appreciated without a name attached to it. And in reality, it's difficult to get a list of names. A lot of the time, surveys are conducted by sending out an email blast to a known population of users. So for example, if you're in business psychology, you will have access to a database of all employees, right? And you could personalize it, certainly. But a lot of the time, you really don't have a list of respondents, and you don't even have the option. But the silver lining is that you can, it doesn't really seem to make a difference as far as whether people will respond or not. Now, certainly it does make a difference if you want to send reminders only to people who haven't responded yet. Then that is an issue, because if you know who's already responded, then you don't need to keep sending them reminders. But there's also the possibility that you don't know who's responded because it's anonymous, right? This is one of the things I'll talk about later when it comes to design. If you don't collect data on people's identities, you don't know who's already responded. You certainly could set that up, but then you run into all kinds of ethical issues and it becomes a big headache. So without going into too much detail, there is always the option of sending out a reminder to all of your respondents that you originally emailed and adding a note saying, if you've already responded to this email, please ignore this message, right? And that is a perfectly viable way to do it while still getting other people to respond if they didn't after the first solicitation. Okay, so definitely an important point. And these numbers will help you double, these points will help you double or triple the number of respondents that you'll get, because after every one of these reminders, you will see one of those spikes. And now the spike is going to be smaller and smaller each time, but it will be there. So let's move on. I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but this is a very important point. Okay, incentives. When you're sending out your solicitation, this is related to design, but basically you could tell people, look, there's going to be a dollar amount for you if you fill this out. That's called conditional. Unconditional means two things. One is that everybody who fills out the survey gets the incentive, whether it's a cash dollar amount or a gift card or some non-monetary swag type of item. That's unconditional as well. So it's used in two ways. But basically, unconditional could mean that you give people money or with the invitation. It's like, here's $5 and I'm going to hope that you actually fill out this survey. Now, I don't want to spend too much time for this, but because in the case of a dissertation, you don't always have enough money to do that. If you have a grant, fantastic. Email me offline. We can talk about details of this. But for most students, there are limited budgets. So what I do want to spend some time on is lottery incentives. This is the most typical form of incentives that I've seen when it comes to dissertations. And so these are basically lotteries, right? For money, gift cards, and non-monetary prizes. And what's interesting about this is, this is a very popular way to do things, right? And I want to read you this quote because there was a review done. Remember, I mentioned this is I love this study by Reusch, not sure, where 32 studies were reviewed on this topic of lottery incentives and found that empirical findings about their influence on participation behavior in web surveys are rather inconclusive. So it's kind of all over the place. Some find benefits of doing a lottery incentive. Some find detriments, compared to unconditional incentives. But basically, what it means is that there's no right or wrong answer here. If you're wondering, okay, should I do unconditional where everybody gets a certain dollar amount, or a lottery? It doesn't really, doing a lottery is not sort of detrimental, put it that way. But going back to unconditional, you'll notice that there is this fact here. Dollar amount does not seem to influence response rates. So if you're paying somebody $1, $100, doesn't really seem to matter. Now, those are extreme cases, right? But if you find that you do have the option in the budget to pay everyone, certainly it's worth your time to do that. But more than likely, you're going to find yourself in this situation. Because if you want to collect data from 150 participants, even if you're doing $1 per person, that's $150. Whereas you could set it up as 3 $50 gift cards. And believe it or not, people will be more likely to respond to a sort of high risk but high gain, as it's called in game theory, solicitation, where the thought of a large payout makes it more likely that someone will participate versus a sure bet that you're going to get $1. It's like, okay, do I want $1 and I know I'm going to get it, but I know I have to spend some time, or do I, risk my time in the hopes that I get a really big payout, but it's a low probability that I'll get it? People will sort of skew towards the high payout option, even though the likelihood of getting it is low. So that's why these lottery incentives are known to work, but also why there's a lot of variability about behavior, because it depends on how many you have, what the value of it is, how large your participant, your sample size ends up being. All these things play a role. So it's kind of all over the place. But in any case, it is something to keep in mind. So I don't want to underestimate its importance. And like I said, people will respond to solicitations that are high risk but high gain. Okay, so solicitations kind of end there, right? And the next thing that I want to talk about is the actual survey design itself. One of the main features is the length or duration of it. Now, obviously, for some dissertations, you're going to have multiple instruments, right? If you're talking about, okay, I want to correlate, I don't know, depression with anxiety. Just random example, right? Well, you're probably going to have to administer both a measure of depression and a measure of anxiety. So that's 2 instruments that you have to administer, right? So that makes it longer. It's always important to design your survey to be as short as possible. But you also need to remember that whatever you're studying, you have to use validated instruments. That's the best case scenario. So you want to find a good balance between length and quality of the data that you'll get. So you don't want to basically design a survey yourself that says, are you depressed? Yes or no, 1 question. That's not really a good measure of depression, right? A validated instrument like the Beck Depression Inventory, on the other hand, which has known psychometric properties, and it has good convergent validity, it has good discriminant validity. All of these properties, it's reliable, are known quantities, and so you want to go with a validated instrument. Now, if there's an abbreviated version that has just as good psychometric properties as some longer version, then fantastic. Find that as part of your lit review, as part of your research design. Find the shortest version that is also of high quality, let's just say, and use that. But for the sake of this presentation, what I want to focus on is the fact that the length of the questionnaire is negatively correlated with response rate. So if you actually have a super long questionnaire, people are going to not choose to participate, because typically you have to say, okay, in your solicitation email, how long it's going to take. And by the way, the kind of language that you want to use is, the survey is expected to take at most. So you give them like the sort of upper end limit of how long it should take. And that actually has a higher likelihood of having people participate. It doesn't talk about attrition though. So if you have, there's a difference between response rate and attrition. So response rate is people who start the survey, okay? But attrition is where once they start, do they finish? If you have an incomplete data set, you can't use it most of the time. So if somebody answers half of your questions and then clicks out, you can't really use their data if you don't have the other half that you need to calculate a score, or if they only fill out data on one variable but not the other, you can't correlate them, so on. So it's important to get as many complete responses as possible. So the shorter your questionnaire, the better. And the sort of rule of thumb here is that for adult participants, you should keep it under an hour at most. Once you start going over an hour, their eyes are going to start rolling back in their head, and they're going to start, dropping like flies, so to speak. And for kids, it's half an hour at most is the best practice. But I mean, most of the time we're not doing research with anyone under 25 years old, so I just have it as adults for under an hour. And the last thing I want to mention here is that there's significantly more attrition if the time announced in the invitation, or I've been calling it a solicitation, whatever, if it misleadingly underestimates the true completion time. So if somebody thinks, it's going to take at most half an hour, and then they're sitting there for 35 minutes, 45 minutes, like, well, come on, like, what's going on, right? And then they say, I don't know how long this is going to take, and they click out and say, forget it. The risk is too much for the gain that I'm going to get here. So you have to make sure that that estimate that you give them in the solicitation, aka invitation, is actually representative of that upper end. If they're, if you say half an hour and they're done in 25 minutes, hey, oh, great, it took me less time than I thought, fantastic. But if you go over, that's where you start to get attrition. Okay, so speaking of length and duration, progress bars. A lot of the platforms that are popular for surveys have the option to include a progress bar. And the question is, well, should you or should you not include it? There's a bit of a complex relationship between a progress bar and the length of the survey. So I'll just let this table speak for me. To walk you through it, so this study is from Crawford et al., 2001, I believe. And what these folks did is they actually manipulated the amount of time that a survey takes, either 8 to 10 minutes or 20 minutes. And then also whether or not there was a progress bar or there was no progress bar. So for the shorter condition, you see that without a progress bar, 67.8% completed. Without a progress bar, 72.2% completed. So a little bit more, right? So it looks like for a shorter survey, no progress bar is better. For a longer survey, this bottom row here, you see that with a progress bar, 69.4% completed. So a little bit more than for a shorter one. But when there's no progress bar, it goes up to 77%. So this is the most out of any of these conditions, right? So if you have a longer survey, definitely don't include a progress bar, because if you do, it'll drop by almost 10%. Well, I guess it's more like 7%, but whatever. You get more complete responses if you don't include a progress bar. And that's true for longer and shorter surveys. And the actual total numbers are a little bit different, but you can see that without a progress bar, you seem to get better responding. There are also, issues dealing with accelerating progress bars and decelerating progress bars, but those are not really what these popular platforms do. They're more linear than anything. So I'm not going to go into that. Okay. The layout of your survey is also important. There are many options that you're given in these different platforms where you can have multiple items per screen or just one item per screen, right? So if you have one question per screen versus a bunch of questions per screen, and you just kind of click through, then that has an effect on the time it takes to complete. So some research has shown that multiple items per screen takes less time than a single item per screen. So that seems like a no-brainer. And also, to kind of piggyback off that, there's no influence of the format on attrition. So whether you have multiple items per screen or one item per screen doesn't really seem to have an influence on attrition. But we do know that even though these effects are small of how much time it takes, that there is a bit of a benefit to having multiple items per screen. Now, since it seems to make little to no difference, keep in mind this, however, I have it in all caps because it's important. And it has to do with psychological instruments specifically. When we're talking about psychological research, you have to think about what the formatting is of the instrument that you're transforming into an online survey. So let's say, for example, that the survey that you want to adapt only exists in a paper and pencil format. So if you have a survey that has 20 questions on a piece of paper, and then you have to flip the page and there's 20 more items, then that's exactly how you should sort of transcribe it into SurveyMonkey or psychsurveys.org or whatever platform you're using. Because otherwise, you don't know if that change has any effect on how people respond. So if there's 20 pages per, 20 items per page on the original instrument, and you change it to one item per page on the internet version, that means that you're changing something about it. So you shouldn't do that. You should try to stick as much as possible to the original instrument. And here I call it a normative instrument, and that's on purpose because what I'm trying to emphasize, is that the original instrument will have normative data, meaning that there are going to be thousands and thousands of participants on whose data the instrument has been refined, revised, and made into this final version that has those high quality psychometric properties. And if you deviate from that, it becomes unclear whether or not you're really tapping into the same kind of mental processing, if you will, that went into all of those normative data. So try to be consistent. That's all. So yeah, just try to be consistent as much as possible. Okay, so layout, pretty important, regardless of whether or not it takes more time or has to do with attrition. It's also important to keep in mind that psychometric properties are very important. Okay, so instructions. Once you have people, filling out the instrument, they click through the solicitation and they're actually going in there, they're going to get some instructions, right? There's going to be a consent form that they have to fill out, and then they're going to have some instructions. You should always indicate that there are no right or wrong answers. Ask them to answer as honestly as possible, and remind them about anonymity and confidentiality. This has a lot to do with the psychometrics that I discussed. If you ensure them that their data are anonymous and confidential, meaning that nobody's going to know who they are, and nobody's going to find out about their data, then they're more likely to answer honestly. And you should also ask them, just literally, answer as honestly as possible. Now, these things are not specific to instruments that already have specific instructions. So if there are specific instructions that an instrument comes with sort of out of the box, you should use those. But if not, then it is always better to have these 3 pieces of information contained before they even get to filling out the instrument. Okay, as far as assuring anonymity, I want to go into a little bit of depth on this because there's some ethical issues involved. Literally, the IRB is going to have issues with your study if you don't include this. So the problem is that people could be afraid of reprisal, being misperceived, being ostracized, being fired due to their data, coming out in the open and being identifiable. So you have to include those statements on the consent form and also in the instructions. On the consent form, it's required, right? But in the instructions, unless there are, like I said, those specific instructions that come with an instrument, you should include them. And here's that ethical point. Do not collect identifying information if it is not needed. Basically, if you collect identifying information, there has to be a good reason to do so. And this website from the Health and Human Services Administration has criteria for when you should or should not collect identifying information. But the bottom line is, unless you have to for some reason, don't. Now, obviously, if you want to contact people about their having won, a gift card or cash or whatever prize, then typically what you'll have is at the end you'll have, please, type in your email address in order to be contacted for the incentive, and then that's where they can provide that information if they choose to. But if not, then that's their choice. Okay, now here's the last point I want to talk about in terms of designing your survey: counterbalancing. The problem is that there are order effects in psychology. So whatever your responses are to let's say you're doing 2 instruments, right? One is about depression, one is about anxiety. If you do the anxiety measure first, then you're going to be thinking about anxiety, and you're going to be, remembering things that made you anxious. You're going to be thinking about how anxious you're going to be later on in the day, sources of anxiety in your life, and you're just going to have a higher heart rate, all these things, right? It's going to prime the way that you respond on the depression inventory. So if anxiety is on your mind, guess what else is going to be on your mind when you're filling out that depression inventory, right? And this has to do with all kinds of instruments. Maybe the first one is about some kind of positive psychology phenomenon, like creativity. I don't know. And then later on, they do one on depression, right? So if you're thinking about how creative you are and things like this, then later you're going to be thinking less about depression, right? So, and that's also going to affect the data that you're going to collect. And if you start to see this pattern over and over and over again, then you're going to get a biased picture of what people's data look like on whatever that second instrument was. So the way to counteract this is to counterbalance the order of administration of your surveys. This is a very sort of standard technique going back decades. And basically all it means is for every other participant that comes in, you change the order in which they do the different instruments. And so that's kind of a guard against having this consistent order effect bias your data. So every single person that fills out your instruments is still going to be biased if you counterbalance it, but they're going to be biased in different ways, right? So the basic theory is that everybody balances everybody else out. And it's important to note that, so I'm kind of jumping ahead, but psych surveys allows for doing this automatically, so you don't have to do it by hand or send out multiple versions of an instrument and so on. In a lot of cases, if you want to do it for free, like in SurveyMonkey, for example, if you want to do counterbalancing for free, you have to set up 2 different surveys and send out one version to half your participants and another version to the other half. And that gets really cumbersome and really confusing and logistically almost impossible, which is why I'm highlighting psych surveys here, because it allows you to do this automatically. It's also important to note that you do not counterbalance items within each instrument. I get this question a lot, where the question is, okay, so you want me to counterbalance my instruments. And it's, by the way, it's not just 2 instruments. You can have 3, 4, however many, and the same thing applies. But you don't counterbalance order of items within each of those, however many instruments you have. So the order of items within the depression inventory stays the same. The order of items in the creativity measure stays the same. The order of items in the anxiety measure stays the same. But the order of the depression, the anxiety, the creativity, all of those are the level at which you're counterbalancing. Okay, and so that's, like I said, the last point about design. I want to spend a minute or two on the different platforms. So SurveyMonkey, the very popular among students, market researchers. It's not specifically geared towards psychology, though. It's great for basic surveys, again, things like marketing and opinion polls and things like this. It's user-friendly as far as design goes, and it exports data to SPSS, which is what we use at the Chicago School for Analysis. But the caveat here is that it costs money to export viable categorical data. What I mean by that is, if you have a question, let's just say about age group, and you have 5 different age groups that you have as response options. So somebody can click on, 25 to 35, 36 to 45, 46 to 55, right? You got those 4 categories. And what will happen is it will create 4 variables, and each one of them will have a 1 if that person checked that option. And what you then have to do by yourself is turn those into one variable, where if somebody said 25 to 34, then that's a value of 1. If they said 35 to 44, that's a 2, so on and so forth. So you have to go from like 4 variables to 1. It's an extra step. Depending on how savvy you are with Excel or SPSS or all these different softwares, that can be a bit of a burden. And if you want SurveyMonkey to do that for you, then there's like a premium membership that you can get. And similarly, it allows you to counterbalance the order of your instruments, but again, you have to pay for that option. So, again, like I said, it's great for basic surveys, but once you start getting into psychology research, they start to jack up the price on you. Qualtrics, similar. Qualtrics is less popular, but I do see folks in business psychology using it. A few others who have grants have used it, where you can sample their user base. They have, I think they advertise like hundreds of thousands of people in this database. It's similar to Amazon's Mechanical Turk, if you're familiar with that. But basically, you can pay per participant, and you tell them what criteria you want, and they will send out a solicitation to all their users who fit those criteria. And so again, there's a cost associated with that, so it's not ideal, but that's life. They also have an option to counterbalance your instruments. I think they call it a randomizer or something like that. I don't remember off the top of my head. Their focus is more on qualitative data than quantitative. So if you're doing a strictly quantitative study, then you might want to, think of a different one, a different platform to use. And it's also costly. It's more expensive than SurveyMonkey if you're going with these premium features, right? They're called premium, but for psychology, they're actually really basic features. And so that's where we get to psychsurveys.org. This has less name recognition, but it is geared towards psychology. So counterbalancing is free, and the sort of user interface, again, straightforward and user-friendly, so you're not losing anything in terms of that. And it also exports data in a very, ready to analyze format. So I don't like to play favorites. This presentation is not brought to you by psychsurveys.org or anything like that, but this is a good one to use specifically if you're in psychology. So take that for what you will. But one other thing that I do want to mention is this point about less name recognition. I forgot to mention this. Thinking back to solicitations, right? If you're sending out a survey and a potential respondent sees psychsurveys.org, what's that? I was expecting a SurveyMonkey link, right? They're like, oh, I don't trust that. But again, if the sender is trusted, right, then this becomes less of an issue. But depending on how you set things up, there is a bit less name recognition with psychsurveys.org. So keep that in the back of your mind. There's nothing wrong with going the SurveyMonkey route, but again, if you want to do a rigorous study and you're using multiple instruments and you want to counterbalance and you want to export your data to be viable, then SurveyMonkey starts to cost you a little bit more money. It's a few $100s if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, long story short, Psych Surveys, pretty good. All right, so that's it. Like I said, this presentation is going to be on our YouTube channel. And if